Elena Ravencroft looked as if God had not only forgotten her, but actively turned his back. Crumpled against the crimson rocks, her once vibrant dress now a tapestry of blood and dust, she cradled a silent bundle to her chest. Her lips were cracked like the parched earth beneath her, her eyes hollow pits staring into the abyss, and the specter of death circled above, a patient vulture awaiting its feast. Yet a flicker of life remained, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. The desert stretched endlessly, a desolate canvas painted with thorns and the ghosts of shattered dreams. 50 yards away, Elena's wagon lay overturned, its wheels spinning listlessly in the faint morning breeze. The horses were gone, vanished into the vastness. Supplies were scattered, a cruel mockery of sustenance. And Marcus, her husband, was simply gone. She pressed her cheek against her baby, Thomas's forehead. He hadn't cried in hours, a silence more terrifying than any scream. His tiny chest barely rose and fell. A fever raged within his frail body, a wildfire threatening to consume him. And Elena knew with a bone-chilling certainty that she was witnessing her son's agonizing demise. Her thoughts fractured into shards of desperation, memories assaulting her like physical blows. She saw the bandits' faces, contorted in cruel amusement as they gunned down Marcus, the predatory glint in their eyes as they assessed her, deciding she wasn't worth the cost of a bullet. They had stolen everything, leaving her with nothing but sand, silence, and the slow, agonizing death of hope. With a surge of adrenaline, Elena tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her, buckling beneath her weight. A searing pain lanced through her side, a brutal reminder of the knife that had found its mark. A dark stain blossomed on her dress, a grim flower blooming in the harsh sunlight. The bleeding had slowed to a trickle, but the damage was irreparable. She was dying, and she knew it. The sun ascended its throne, transforming the desert into a blazing furnace. Elena's throat felt like shattered glass. Water, food, hope, all were distant memories, luxuries she could no longer afford. Yet she clung to Thomas with a ferocity born of desperation, whispering promises she knew she could never fulfill, lullabies to a son who might never hear them. Then she heard it, a whisper on the wind, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps on stone. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Her hand instinctively sought the small knife concealed in her boot, her fingers closing around its worn handle. The bandits. They had returned. She was certain of it. They had come back to savor their victory, to extinguish the last spark of defiance. But as she raised her head, squinting against the blinding glare, what emerged from behind the rocks shattered her preconceived notions and froze the very blood in her veins. A figure emerged from the heat haze, tall, lean, moving with the sinuous grace of a desert predator. Dark, unbound hair framed strong shoulders, hinting at the raw power beneath. Weathered hands, calloused and strong, gripped a rifle, a silent promise of both protection and threat. The face, etched with the harsh realities of the desert, belonged to an Apache warrior. Elena had heard the stories, the horrifying tales whispered around settler campfires. Scalping, torture, women and children abducted in the dead of night, a brutal legacy devoid of mercy. The Apache stopped 20 feet away, his gaze unwavering, scrutinizing her with dark, unreadable eyes that seemed to penetrate her very soul. Elena instinctively clutched Thomas closer, her body trembling uncontrollably, a leaf caught in a violent storm. She tried to speak, to plead, but only a broken whisper escaped her lips, lost in the vast emptiness. But the stranger didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to some unheard melody carried on the desert wind. His gaze shifted, moving from Elena to the still form of the baby, then to the ever-widening pool of blood staining the ground beneath her. For an eternity, neither of them moved, suspended in a tableau of life and death. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the inevitable. Then, with a deliberate, measured stride, the Apache took a step forward. Elena's mind screamed at her to flee, to protect her child at any cost, but her body remained paralyzed, trapped in a macabre dance with fate. She was caught between a rock and a man who could snuff out her life with a single, effortless motion. All she could do was watch, her heart pounding in her ears as he approached, knowing that whatever transpired in the next few moments would determine whether her baby lived or died. And in that heart-stopping moment, as the stranger's shadow enveloped her face, Elena understood that everything she thought she knew about survival, about prejudice, about the very nature of humanity, was about to be irrevocably transformed. The Apache crouched slowly, his movements deliberate and cautious, as if approaching a skittish animal. Elena's breath hitched in her throat, coming in short, shallow gasps. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to shield Thomas, but her strength had deserted her, leaving her powerless. The warrior's eyes, however, weren't filled with the expected cruelty, the savage glee she had braced herself for. Instead, she saw something unexpected, something that resonated deep within her own despair, a flicker of concern. He spoke softly, his voice a low, melodic rumble, uttering words in his native tongue that sounded like water cascading over smooth stones. Elena shook her head frantically, pressing Thomas tighter against her chest, her gaze pleading. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. "Don't hurt him. He's just a baby." The Apache paused, his expression unreadable, then spoke again, this time in halting, broken English. "Water?" He pointed to a worn leather pouch hanging at his side. "Baby, sick." Elena's mind reeled, struggling to reconcile this reality with the terrifying legends that haunted her nightmares. Apache warriors didn't offer solace to dying settlers. They didn't speak with gentle voices, nor did they display concern for white children. Yet here stood this man, his weathered face etched with what appeared to be genuine worry, offering her a lifeline. He reached slowly for his water pouch, his movements deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal. Elena flinched, recoiling instinctively, but she was too weak, too exhausted to resist. The Apache uncorked the pouch, the scent of cool, clean water filling the air, and held it towards her, his dark eyes urging her to trust. "Drink," he said simply, his voice devoid of threat. Elena stared at the offered water, her throat burning with an unquenchable thirst. A voice whispered in her mind, a chorus of fear and prejudice. "It could be poisoned. It could be a trick. He's trying to lure you into a trap." But Thomas was fading in her arms, the faint rise and fall of his chest growing ever more imperceptible. And she, too, was succumbing to the relentless grip of death. What choice did she have? She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the worn leather of the pouch. The water was warm but clean, and it felt like liquid salvation, a balm washing away the grime and despair that had clung to her for so long, pouring down her parched throat. She drank greedily, savoring each precious drop, then carefully dripped some between Thomas's parched lips. The baby stirred slightly, a faint flutter of movement, the first sign of life he had shown in hours. The Apache watched intently, his dark eyes reflecting the faintest glimmer of hope. He spoke again, uttering words Elena didn't understand, but his tone was urgent, almost commanding. He pointed towards the distant horizon, then back at Thomas. "Medicine," he said, struggling with the unfamiliar English word. "Baby needs medicine." Elena followed his gaze, her eyes scanning the vast emptiness of the desert. She saw nothing but endless sand and shimmering heat haze, but the Apache seemed resolute, his gaze fixed on something beyond her comprehension. He stood and walked towards the overturned wagon, his movements fluid and efficient, examining the scattered supplies with practiced eyes. He returned moments later, carrying a piece of torn canvas, and began fashioning it into a crude sling, his deft fingers working with surprising gentleness. Elena couldn't decipher the unfolding events, struggling to reconcile them with her ingrained beliefs. Every story she had ever heard about Apache warriors painted them as merciless killers, fueled by hatred and vengeance. Yet, this man was trying to save her son, offering a glimmer of hope in the face of utter despair. Why? The Apache finished the sling and approached her again, his face etched with a strange mix of determination and compassion. He gestured towards Thomas, then towards himself, his meaning unmistakable. Elena's heart seized in her chest, a cold hand gripping her soul. He wanted to take her baby. "No!" she gasped, instinctively pulling Thomas closer, her voice choked with panic. "You can't have him!" But the Apache shook his head, his expression unwavering. He pointed to Elena's bleeding wound, then to the blazing sun overhead, silently conveying the devastating consequences of inaction. He spoke rapidly in his native tongue, frustration coloring his voice, then said something that resonated with the desperate core of her being, something that shattered her fear and replaced it with a sliver of agonizing hope. "Baby dies here," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Baby lives there." He pointed towards the distant mountains, their jagged peaks piercing the sky. "Choose." Elena stared at him, her mind racing, her emotions colliding in a maelstrom of fear, trust, and a desperate, all-consuming love for her child. He wasn't trying to steal Thomas from her. He was offering him a chance at life, a chance she couldn't provide. But that meant entrusting her child, her very heart, to an Apache warrior, a man she had known for mere moments. And as Thomas's breathing grew more shallow, his skin burning with fever, Elena realized she was facing the most impossible, most agonizing decision of her life. A choice that would forever define her existence. Elena's entire world had collapsed into this one agonizing moment. The Apache stood waiting, his dark eyes unwavering, fixed intently on her face. Thomas was weakening rapidly, his skin burning with an inferno she couldn't extinguish. She could feel his tiny heart fluttering against her chest, a frantic, desperate rhythm like a dying bird. The warrior's name was Ayana, a name that would soon be etched forever into her memory, though she didn't know it yet. What she saw wasn't the savage beast from the stories. It was a man who moved with the quiet confidence of someone deeply connected to this unforgiving land, someone who understood the delicate dance of survival in ways she could never comprehend. "Where?" Elena managed to ask, her voice a broken whisper, cracking with despair. "Where would you take him?" Ayana pointed toward a cluster of rocky hills in the distance, their slopes shrouded in shadows. "Medicine woman, heals children." He paused, searching for the elusive English words. "My sister." Elena's mind struggled to process this revelation. An Apache medicine woman? The tales she had heard were filled with dark rituals, terrifying blood sacrifices, and ancient, unknowable magic. But as she looked down at Thomas, she saw his lips were turning a frightening shade of blue, a grim harbinger of impending death. Whatever consuming fever ravaged his body was winning. Ayana seemed to sense her hesitation, her internal struggle. He knelt beside her again, his movements fluid and graceful, and gently touched Thomas's forehead with his weathered fingers, a gesture surprisingly tender. When he pulled his hand away, Elena could see the worry etched deep within his features, etched alongside the years of hardship he must have faced. "Baby, very sick," he said quietly, his voice laced with a deep sorrow. "White medicine, too far. Apache medicine, close." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the crushing weight of the impossible choice pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate her. Trust an Apache warrior with her dying son, placing his fragile life in the hands of a perceived enemy, or watch Thomas slip away in her arms, both of them succumbing to the relentless sun and the slow, agonizing grip of death. Her thoughts drifted to Marcus, her beloved husband, her partner in this arduous journey. He would have vehemently opposed this, calling her insane for even considering it. Marcus had always warned her that the Apache were animals, that they couldn't be trusted under any circumstances. But Marcus was gone, silenced forever by the bandits' cruelty, and Thomas was dying, his life hanging precariously in the balance. And this Apache warrior, this supposed savage, was the only beacon of hope she had left. Elena opened her eyes, her gaze locking with Ayana's. What she saw wasn't the cold, heartless savagery she had braced herself for, but the reflection of a man who understood the profound agony of watching a child suffer, the helplessness that gnawed at the soul. "Will you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a desperate plea. "Will you bring him back to me?" Ayana nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering, his dark eyes holding a solemn promise. "Promise," he said, the single word laden with weight and meaning. It was clear that this promise held profound significance for him, a sacred vow he would not break. Elena's hands shook uncontrollably as she began to loosen her grip on Thomas, her fingers slowly uncurling from his fragile form. Every maternal instinct, every protective impulse screamed against what she was about to do, a chorus of agonizing protests. But she could feel the sun climbing higher in the sky, its heat becoming more intense, more brutal with each passing moment. If they remained here, stranded in this desolate wasteland, they would both be dead before nightfall, their hopes and dreams swallowed by the unforgiving desert. She lifted Thomas towards Ayanna, her heart breaking with every inch of space that opened between them, the chasm of uncertainty widening with each breath. "Please," she whispered, her voice thick with tears, a desperate supplication echoing across the barren landscape. "Save him! I beg you, save my son!" Ayanna accepted the baby with reverent care, his movements deliberate and gentle, cradling Thomas against his chest as if he were made of spun glass, a priceless treasure entrusted to his safe keeping. He secured the infant in the makeshift sling, adjusting it with meticulous precision until Thomas was shielded from the harsh rays of the sun, protected from the elements. Then, something unexpected happened. A gesture that defied all her preconceived notions. Ayanna reached down and slipped his strong arm under Elena's shoulders, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the evident strength he possessed. "You come too," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Both live, or both die." Elena stared at him in stunned disbelief, her mind struggling to process the implications of his words. She had assumed he would take Thomas and leave her to her fate, a sacrifice deemed necessary for the baby's survival. That was what the stories dictated, the harsh, unforgiving reality she had come to accept. But this man, this Apache warrior, was defying expectations, was determined to save them both, even at his own peril. "I can't walk," Elena protested weakly, wincing as a fresh wave of pain surged through her side, a brutal reminder of her injuries. "I'll only slow you down." Ayanna's response was immediate and decisive. Without a word, he effortlessly lifted her from the ground, his strength defying her expectations. Elena gasped as pain shot through her body, radiating outwards from her wounded side, but she found herself cradled securely against the Apache's chest. Thomas nestled safely between them, protected by Ayanna's unwavering strength. As Ayanna began walking towards the distant hills, his steps measured and purposeful, Elena realized that everything she thought she knew about the world, about the boundaries of compassion, had just been irrevocably shattered, turned upside down by this unexpected act of kindness. But behind them, hidden among the jagged rocks where they couldn't see, 3 pairs of eyes watched their departure with growing interest, their gazes filled with avarice and a simmering desire for vengeance. The bandits, the ruthless killers who had left Elena for dead, were returning to scavenge what remained, expecting to find nothing but a corpse and scattered possessions. But they had stumbled upon something far more valuable than they could have ever imagined, a prize that would ignite their greed and fuel their relentless pursuit. Ayanna moved across the desert with an uncanny sense of direction, as if he were following an invisible map etched onto the very landscape. His steps were sure and steady, each movement purposeful and efficient, even while burdened with the weight of Elena and Thomas. Elena could feel the raw power in his arms, the subtle adjustments he made to his grip to protect her wounded side without her uttering a single word. A silent communication born of necessity and a shared understanding of their precarious situation. The sun continued its relentless climb towards its zenith, turning the air into shimmering waves of oppressive heat, a suffocating blanket that threatened to overwhelm them. But Ayanna seemed to possess an innate knowledge of the land, knowing every shadow, every outcropping of rock that could offer momentary respite from the scorching rays. He paused frequently to give Elena sips of water from his dwindling supply and to check on Thomas, his touch surprisingly gentle as he monitored the baby's labored breathing. During one of these brief respites, Elena found herself studying Ayanna's face more closely, searching for answers to the questions that swirled within her mind. There were deep lines etched around his eyes, testament to years spent enduring the harsh realities of the desert, battling the elements and facing countless dangers. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a permanent reminder of a past conflict, a story she could only imagine. But there was something else in his expression, something far deeper than the physical scars, a profound sadness that seemed to reach down to the very depths of his soul, a weight he carried with quiet dignity. "Why are you helping us?" Elena asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Ayanna remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if searching for the answers within the vast expanse of the desert. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and resonant, carrying the weight of untold stories and a profound, enduring pain. "I had son once," he said simply, his words carefully chosen, each syllable resonating with sorrow. "Fever took him, too fast. No medicine woman, close enough." He looked down at Thomas, his gaze filled with a mixture of sadness and a desperate hope. "Could not save him." Elena felt her throat constrict with emotion, a surge of empathy washing over her as she began to understand the driving force behind Ayanna's actions. This wasn't merely about helping strangers in need. This was about redemption, about attempting to save the child he had been powerless to save before, a chance to rewrite his own tragic past. They continued their arduous journey, but Elena began to notice something troubling, a subtle change in Ayanna's demeanor that set her on edge. He kept glancing back over his shoulder, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with increasing frequency. His jaw was clenched tight, and his pace had quickened slightly, his movements becoming more urgent. "What is it?" Elena asked, her voice laced with concern, sensing the impending danger. "Being followed," Ayanna replied grimly, his voice devoid of emotion, his gaze unwavering. "3 men, on horses." Elena's blood turned to ice, a wave of nausea washing over her. The bandits. They had survived the initial encounter and were now relentlessly pursuing them, drawn by the promise of plunder and fueled by a burning desire for revenge. "They want us," Elena whispered, her voice trembling with fear, remembering the cold, predatory cruelty in their eyes, the utter disregard for human life. Ayanna nodded grimly, his face etched with a grim determination. "Want woman, want Apache scalp, big reward, for both." The situation was rapidly deteriorating, the odds stacking against them with each passing moment. Ayanna was strong, a skilled warrior, but he was on foot, carrying the burden of 2 people, one of whom was seriously wounded and the other clinging precariously to life. 3 mounted men, armed and relentless, would inevitably catch them long before they reached the safety of the medicine woman's camp. Elena could see Ayanna's mind working, calculating distances, assessing the terrain, and weighing the limited possibilities. His free hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, his fingers tightening around the worn handle, a silent promise of the fight to come. "Put me down!" Elena said suddenly, her voice laced with a desperate urgency. "No," Ayanna replied without hesitation, his voice firm and unwavering, brooking no argument. "You can move faster. Without me, take Thomas, and go." Ayanna stopped walking, his gaze locking with Elena's, his eyes conveying a fierce determination that surprised her. "Told you before, both live or both die. No changing." Elena was stunned by the unwavering conviction in his voice, the fierce loyalty that transcended their differences. This Apache warrior, who owed her nothing, was willing to risk everything, even his own life, to keep his word, to honor a promise made to a stranger. But the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed across the desolate landscape, growing louder with each passing moment, a grim reminder of the approaching threat. Ayanna's expression hardened, his gaze sweeping across the terrain around them, searching for any advantage, any defensible ground that could offer them a chance of survival. About 200 yards ahead, Elena could see a cluster of large boulders, their imposing forms creating a natural fortress, a potential sanctuary in the face of the impending storm. "Can you hold baby?" Ayanna asked, his voice clipped and efficient, wasting no words. Elena nodded, her arms aching, her strength waning, but her resolve unwavering. Ayanna carefully transferred Thomas to her arms, his touch gentle despite the urgency of the moment. Then, with a burst of speed that belied his burden, he began running towards the rocks, his long strides eating up the ground, a blur of motion against the backdrop of the unforgiving desert. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew louder, the thunder of approaching horses shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Angry voices carried on the desert wind, fueled by rage and a thirst for vengeance. As they reached the relative safety of the boulders, Elena heard something that made her heart sink, a voice that sent a chill down her spine. One of the bandits was shouting instructions to the others, his words clear and distinct despite the distance. She recognized the gravelly voice, the unmistakable timbre of Jake Morrison, the ruthless leader of the gang that had murdered her husband, the man who had condemned her to this agonizing ordeal. And he sounded like a man who had found exactly what he was looking for, his tone laced with triumph. Ayanna positioned Elena and Thomas behind the largest boulder, creating a makeshift shield against the approaching danger. Then, with practiced efficiency, he checked his rifle, his movements swift and economical. Elena could see him counting bullets, his face grim as he realized how severely they were outnumbered, how desperate their situation had become. The hoofbeat stopped about 50 yards away, the silence that followed more terrifying than the approaching storm. Elena heard Jake Morrison's gravelly voice calling out across the desert, his words laced with mocking amusement. "Well, well, looks like our little dove didn't die after all. Seems she had a little fight left in her." Jake's laughter echoed across the desolate landscape, a cruel, chilling sound that sent shivers down Elena's spine. "And she's made herself a friend, an Apache friend. How touching." Elena pressed Thomas closer to her chest, trying to soothe his labored breathing, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. The baby was growing weaker by the minute, his fever spiking in the oppressive desert heat. They needed to reach the medicine woman soon, but now they were trapped, surrounded by enemies with no hope of escape. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake continued, his tone shifting from mocking amusement to cold, calculated malice. "You're going to send that Apache out here with his hands up nice and slow, then you're going to walk out real slow like, and maybe, just maybe, we won't make this too painful for either of you." Ayanna's response was immediate and defiant. He raised his rifle and fired a shot that sent one of the bandits diving for cover behind his horse, shattering the uneasy silence. The message was clear. He would not surrender. He would fight to the death to protect those under his care. "Apache dog!" Jake shouted, his voice erupting in a roar of fury, his mocking tone replaced by unbridled rage. "You just signed your death warrant, now you're both gonna pay." Gunfire erupted from 3 different positions, a barrage of bullets ripping through the air. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying, a deadly hail of destruction. Ayanna returned fire methodically, his movements precise and economical, making every shot count, conserving his dwindling ammunition. Elena found herself in an impossible situation, a nightmare unfolding around her. She was wounded, losing blood rapidly, holding a dying baby in her arms, trapped with a man she barely knew, surrounded by ruthless killers who wanted them both dead. If you were Elena, what would you do? Trust completely in Ayanna's proven fighting skills and stay hidden, protecting Thomas as best you can, or try to help him fight, even though it might put Thomas at greater risk, potentially exposing him to the deadly crossfire. The decision you make could determine whether any of them survive the next 10 minutes. Elena made her choice, driven by a mother's fierce love and a desperate need to protect her child. With painstaking care, she placed Thomas in a small depression between 2 rocks, creating a makeshift cradle where he would be shielded from stray bullets, as safe as she could possibly make him in this chaotic maelstrom. Then, summoning every last ounce of her strength, she reached for the small pistol she had hidden beneath her tattered dress, her fingers closing around the cold, familiar metal. "Can you use that?" Ayanna asked, his voice calm despite the hail of bullets impacting around them, his keen eyes noticing her movement. "Marcus taught me," Elena replied, her voice surprisingly steady, a flicker of resolve igniting within her. She checked the cylinder, her fingers fumbling slightly but her purpose clear. 4 bullets, she stated, the limited ammunition a stark reminder of their precarious situation. Ayanna nodded approvingly, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Wait for my signal. When I draw their fire, you take the one on the left. Make your shots count." The plan was desperate, a last-ditch effort born of necessity, but it was their only chance, a gamble with the highest stakes imaginable. Ayanna counted down with his fingers, his gaze unwavering, his movements precise and economical. 3, 2, 1. He stood up, a figure of stoic defiance against the backdrop of the desert, and fired rapidly at the center position, unleashing a volley of shots that forced Jake and his men to take cover, diverting their attention. Elena seized the opportunity, rising from her protected position, and aimed at the bandit who had circled to their left, attempting to flank them. Her first shot went wide, the bullet impacting harmlessly against the rocks, but her second found its mark, catching him in the shoulder with a sickening thud, spinning him around and eliciting a cry of pain. "The woman's armed!" the wounded bandit yelled, his voice laced with panic, his eyes wide with surprise. "She's got a gun!" But Elena's intervention, however limited, had given Ayanna the opening he desperately needed. His next shot found its mark with deadly accuracy, and one of the bandits fell silent, his body slumping to the ground, his life extinguished in the blink of an eye. Jake Morrison's voice rose above the din of battle, erupting in a roar of rage and frustration. "Kill them both!" he bellowed, his voice filled with unadulterated fury. "I want that Apache's scalp, and I want that woman to pay for what she did to my men." The remaining two bandits pressed their attack with renewed ferocity, spurred by Jake's rage and the promise of a gruesome reward, using their horses as mobile shields, charging closer to the rocks and unleashing a barrage of gunfire. Ayanna's rifle clicked empty, the sound a stark reminder of their dwindling resources. With a fluid, practiced motion, he smoothly drew his knife, the honed blade glinting in the harsh sunlight, a silent promise of close-quarters combat. Elena had 2 bullets left, 2 precious chances to turn the tide. Thomas was burning with fever behind her, his labored breathing a constant reminder of his fragile state, and Jake Morrison was circling around to a position where he could shoot down at them from above, his silhouette a menacing presence against the azure sky. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, intensifying the oppressive heat and turning the rocks into a scorching furnace as the battle reached its fevered climax. Elena could hear Ayanna's steady breathing beside her, a source of strength and reassurance amidst the chaos, and could feel his absolute determination to protect them both, his unwavering resolve a beacon in the darkness. But when she looked up at the rocks above them and saw Jake Morrison's menacing silhouette against the sky, his rifle aimed directly at Thomas, his finger tightening on the trigger, Elena realized that even Ayanna's extraordinary warrior skills might not be enough, that they were on the verge of being overwhelmed. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, stretching out into an eternity as Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, and Elena found herself facing a split-second decision that would haunt her forever, a choice that could mean the difference between life and death for her son. Elena's world narrowed to a pinprick of light, focused entirely on the imminent threat looming above. Jake Morrison's rifle barrel gleamed ominously in the harsh sunlight, aimed with unwavering precision at Thomas, her precious son. Her baby lay helpless and vulnerable between the rocks, his tiny chest rising and falling with each shallow, labored breath, his fate hanging precariously in the balance. Without conscious thought, driven by a primal instinct that transcended fear and self-preservation, Elena threw herself forward, her body a shield, a desperate barrier between her son and the impending death. Just as Jake's rifle cracked, shattering the tense silence, she intercepted the bullet's path. The projectile meant for her son tore through her shoulder instead, the impact spinning her around and sending waves of excruciating fire through her already wounded body, threatening to overwhelm her. Ayanna reacted with lightning-fast reflexes, his movements a blur of controlled fury. His knife left his hand in one fluid, seamless motion, spinning end over end through the unforgiving desert air, a deadly projectile seeking its target. Jake Morrison's scream of triumph, a guttural sound filled with sadistic glee, was abruptly cut short, turning into a gurgle of shock and disbelief as the Apache's blade found its mark with deadly accuracy, piercing the space between his ribs and silencing him forever. The ruthless bandit leader toppled backward off the rocks, his lifeless body tumbling down the slope, his rifle clattering uselessly beside him. his reign of terror brought to an abrupt and violent end. But the remaining gunman, fueled by rage and desperation, wasn't finished. He spurred his horse forward, charging directly at their position with reckless abandon, his pistol blazing, unleashing a hail of bullets. Ayanna had no time to retrieve another weapon, his rifle lying uselessly on the ground, his knife embedded in Morrison's lifeless body. He spread his arms wide, making himself a conspicuous target, drawing the enemy's fire away from Elena and Thomas, sacrificing himself to protect those under his care. Elena, bleeding profusely from 2 grievous wounds now, her vision blurring, her strength fading rapidly, raised her pistol with shaking hands, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. She had 1 bullet left, one precious chance to alter the course of events, to save Ayanna from certain death. The bandit was so close she could see the hate contorting his features, could see the glint of madness in his eyes, see his fingers squeezing the trigger that would end Ayanna's life, silencing his warrior spirit forever. Summoning every last ounce of her resolve, clinging to the faintest spark of hope, Elena fired. Her bullet, guided by desperation and a mother's love, caught the horse in the chest, the impact sending a shockwave through the animal's frame. The horse reared up in agony, its forelegs pawing at the air, throwing its rider violently from its back. The man hit the unforgiving rocks with a sickening crack, the sound echoing across the barren landscape, and lay still, his body broken and lifeless. A sudden silence descended upon the desert, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence that had just unfolded. The only sounds were Elena's ragged, gasping breaths, punctuated by the faint but unmistakable sound of Thomas's weak crying, a sound that both broke her heart and filled it with a sliver of hope. Ayanna knelt beside Elena, his movements swift and efficient, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the urgency of the situation, examining her new wound with practiced fingers. "Bad?" Elena asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper, though she could already feel the warm, sticky sensation of blood soaking through her tattered dress, a grim confirmation of her fears. "Bad enough," Ayanna replied honestly, his face etched with concern, his dark eyes conveying the gravity of her condition. "But not dying bad. Not yet." He worked quickly, tearing strips from his own shirt to bind both her wounds, stemming the flow of blood and providing a modicum of comfort. His hands were steady and sure, but Elena could see the urgency in his movements, the unspoken acknowledgement that time was running out for all of them. Thomas's fever was raging even higher now, his small body struggling to combat the infection and the relentless heat. The stress and trauma of the battle had pushed his fragile form to its limits, threatening to overwhelm him. When Elena touched his forehead, his skin felt like it was burning from the inside, radiating an infernal heat. "How far to your sister?" Elena asked weakly, her voice barely audible, her strength ebbing away with each passing moment. Ayanna looked towards the distant hills, his gaze unwavering, calculating the distance and the obstacles that lay between them. 2 hours, he replied, his voice firm but laced with concern, his dark eyes conveying the urgency of their situation. "Maybe less if I run. If I—" Elena struggled to sit up, wincing as a wave of searing pain shot through her shoulder, threatening to overwhelm her. "Then run," she urged, her voice desperate, her gaze pleading. "Take Thomas and go. You have to save him." "No," Ayanna said firmly, his voice unwavering, his gaze locking with hers. "Told you before. I made a promise." "You don't understand," Elena gasped, her breathing becoming more labored, her vision blurring once more. "I'm slowing you down. Thomas needs medicine now, not in 3 hours because you're carrying me." Ayanna remained silent for a long moment, his face a mask of inner turmoil, torn between his unwavering loyalty and the harsh realities of their situation. Elena could see the conflict raging within him, the agonizing choice he was being forced to make. "Your sister, will she help him?" Elena asked, her voice laced with hope, clinging to the last vestiges of faith. "Yes," Ayanna replied, his voice resolute, his eyes filled with conviction. "She heals many children, Apache and white." Elena made her decision, accepting the inevitable. She carefully lifted Thomas, cradling him gently in her arms, and placed him in Ayanna's care. "Then take my son," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion, her heart shattering into a million pieces. "Save his life, please, save my son's life." But as Ayana prepared to leave, his footsteps hesitant, Elena heard something that sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over her, a sound that threatened to extinguish the last embers of hope. More hoofbeats, distant but unmistakable, growing closer with each passing moment. Jake Morrison's gang had been larger than they had initially thought, and the distinct sound of gunfire had drawn the remaining members like wolves to wounded prey, their arrival signaling a new wave of terror. Ayana's head snapped up, his senses immediately alert, his warrior instincts taking over. He assessed the approaching threat with practiced efficiency, his gaze hardening with grim determination. From the sound, at least 4 riders, maybe 5, were rapidly approaching their position. Too many to fight while protecting a wounded woman and a dying baby. Too many to overcome without risking everything. Elena saw the calculations flashing through his mind, the agonizing choices he was being forced to consider, and knew what he was thinking. "Go," she whispered urgently, her voice a desperate plea, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Take Thomas and run. I'll slow them down here, give you a chance to escape." "With what?" Ayana asked, his gaze sweeping over her empty pistol, lying uselessly on the ground in her battered, wounded condition. "You can barely stand. You won't stand a chance." Elena's hand moved instinctively towards Jake Morrison's fallen rifle, lying within her reach, its presence a symbol of both hope and despair. It was heavier and more cumbersome than her pistol, but it was loaded, offering her a fighting chance. "I'll make do," she said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve, her gaze unwavering. Ayana shook his head, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You cannot fight 5 men alone," he said, his voice firm but laced with protest. "It's suicide." "I don't have to win," Elena replied, her voice unwavering, her determination fueled by a mother's love. "I just have to give you time." Elena huddled tighter, the deafening gunfire a stark contrast to the fragile life cradled in her arms. Ayana fought with a ferocity born of desperation, a silent guardian against the storm of bullets. But even his skill couldn't hold back the tide forever. Through it all, a profound truth emerged. Even in the face of unimaginable cruelty and seemingly insurmountable odds, humanity can bloom in the most unexpected places. It's a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the understanding that binds us together, even across cultures and perceived divides. The world is full of stories where kindness and empathy can change fates, forging unlikely alliances and revealing the shared heart beating beneath us all. What do you think will happen next? I'd love to hear your thoughts, predictions, or any questions you have about Elena and Ayana's desperate struggle. Feel free to leave a comment below. I'm excited to read your perspectives. And if you enjoyed this glimpse into their world, please subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Let's explore the depths of their journey together.